The following presentation is brought to you by the Virginia Council for the Social Studies. Hello, and welcome to the Real American Revolution, a multimedia program to discuss with noted authors and historians what really happened before, during, and after America's War for Independence. Now, my name is Randy Flood, and today my guest is historian John Beakes. John graduated from the United States Naval Academy in 1966 and served in nuclear submarines until 1974, when he began a business career of executive leadership in technology service companies. John is the co-author, along with Jim Pikek, of Cool, Deliberate Courage, John Eager Howard in the American Revolution, and Light Horse Harry Lee in the War for Independence. John has authored Otho Holland Williams in the American Revolution, and also DeKalb, one of Revolutionary War's bravest generals, and a military biography of William Campbell, today's subject. John is currently working on a military biography of Elijah Clark in the American Revolution, a Georgia backcountry partisan militiaman. Today, I'll be talking to John about William Campbell in the American Revolution, commander of Riflemen at Kings Mountain and Guilford Courthouse. So, John, welcome to the Real American Revolution.
Thank you very much, Randy.
Well, John, very few people know about William Campbell. Who was he, and what led you to the research to write about him?
Well, he was a very distinguished magnate of southwestern Virginia from a family. The Campbell family is well known all the way back to the Scotch-Irish immigration into the United States. They had good land in the Shenandoah Valley. He was a member of the Virginia House of Delegates. He was a friend of Thomas Jefferson, a friend of Patrick Henry, a friend of Marquis de Lafayette. So he was well educated. He went to a school named the Augusta Academy at the time, which today is Washington Lee University. So he had a Scottish background, Scotch-Irish, descended from the clans. He was tall, dignified in appearance, well educated, could speak intelligently with the Jefferson or on Henry. And he became a leader of the military. He didn't seek a military career, but it started with Dunmore's War. He was a captain because he was well known in the community and so forth. But he learned discipline there, how to get the troops up in the morning, how to feed everybody, how to get the people to move and so forth. And then he spent a year in the Continental Army in Williamsburg, Virginia, under the command of Patrick Henry. So he learned the military starting at age 26. He had no prior training at all, but he became an instinctive leader. And of course, he was chosen by the group of leaders that came together for the Battle of Kings Mountain as their leader at the day of the battle. So he's a distinguished person. Again, very few people know about him. It's interesting that there are a lot of people that study the Battle of Kings Mountain and the lead up to it and so forth. But even they know very little about Campbell himself. And one of the reasons is he died before the end of the Revolution. He died before Yorktown, only 36 years old. So he sort of faded into the background as other people lived longer, Shelby, Isaac Shelby, John Sevier, and other leaders of that ilk. But, and I actually stumbled upon him when I was working on Harry Lee, Light Horse Harry Lee. They fought together on the left flank at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. And the relationship between Lee and Campbell became of interest to me. I got interested in the personality of Campbell, and it led me to do the research, and I found him more and more fascinating the more I knew. And I feel good about people interested in the revolution. You know, there's a good cadre of that in the South. They appreciate knowing about someone that's been kind of under the radar for a while.
That's terrific. Well, you mentioned Campbell's relationships with Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson and the Marquis de Lafayette. Could you go in a little bit more detail about that? What was significant about that type of relationship? Wasn't he connected to Henry by marrying Henry's sister?
Well, that's what I said. When he was in the military in Williamsburg early in the war, 1776, his commanding officer was Patrick Henry. And one of the things I learned about Campbell, he made friends wherever he went. He was a gracious, I say he was the best possible friend and the worst possible enemy. He was also a terrific warrior. But he worked for Henry, who was the commanding officer of the Virginia militia early in the war. And he got to know Henry and went to his home and up near Richmond and met Henry's sister, Elizabeth. And lo and behold, he married Elizabeth, Patrick Henry's sister. And one of the great stories is he, at the end of his year in Williamsburg, he went to that Patrick Henry home and picked up his wife and drove her to their home down near Abington, Virginia. And everybody, they liked him, but they were excited about her. This is Patrick Henry's sister. So everywhere she went, there were crowds that wanted to know because Henry was by far at that time the most famous person in Virginia.
Hmm.
So he was a brother-in-law to Patrick Henry. They were close friends from the first time that they had served together in the Continental Army. Now, Jefferson was the governor of Virginia for a period of time in the House of Delegates, and Campbell served with him in the House. So they knew each other
Right.
in that. They had the relationship there. And it's very clear from correspondence that Jefferson respected him terrifically. You know, Randy, I've heard many times that George Washington dominated every room he ever entered. Well, he was
Mhm.
tall. He was impressive. He had physical stature and he was quiet. You know, he talked when there was really something to say. So he sort of could control a room. I think Campbell was like that. He was well
Hmm.
educated. His letters are really beautifully written. So he was a well
Hmm.
educated individual, but I think he knew how to handle himself. And the Marquis de Lafayette was his commanding officer at the end of the war.
Hmm.
Lafayette was commanding in Virginia, and he selected Campbell to be his commander of his rifle corps. And he spoke very, very highly of. And you know, when Campbell died of swamp fever, Lafayette sent a large delegation to his funeral. He couldn't go himself, but he paid great respect to his friend Campbell there at that. So they were he could integrate well and communicate well and operate well with people that were the senior leaders of the political structure, certainly in Virginia. And I think that the significance of that is he had the potential to serve in a senior capacity later on if he had lived.
That's interesting. Well, you mentioned Kings Mountain earlier, and you and I've talked about that in the past. That it's certainly one of the most important battles of the American Revolution and a true turning point, certainly in the Southern campaigns. Why do you think that Isaac Shelby, who was a giant in his own right, as well as John Sevier, and the other commanders that at all were well known in their regions, why do you think they selected Campbell to be their overall commander at Kings Mountain?
Right. Well, there's historians that said along the way Campbell had 400 Virginians under his command, and that Shelby had 200, Sevier had 200. So some of the Cleveland had fewer than 400. So some of the literature says they picked Campbell because he had the most people. Now I am making a lot of suppositions here, but I've done a lot of reading and I've done a lot of study, and it just seems to me here's a man. First of all, he had this presence. He was tall, strong, straight backed, athletic individual. He had presence. He was not a big talker, but he was the kind of person that when he did speak, people listened. But he was a member of the Virginia legislature. He was a graduate of Augusta Academy, which is Washington Lee University. Shelby and Sevier, for all their wonderful attributes, were not educated as he was. They were not friends with Patrick Henry, that kind of a thing. So I believe in my heart, without any minutes of the meeting where they discussed this kind of a thing, that he just had the stature that it was kind of natural that, and you know, they all worked together. It wasn't the kind of thing where he was a domineering leader. It was sort of a
Hmm.
coordinator, sort of a chairman of the board, because they were very severe. Cleveland, Shelby, all those were tremendous leaders in their own right. But I
Hmm.
think they looked up to him. I really do, and it was almost an instinctive kind of a thing. But that's my supposition after studying quite a bit. The only written records that I know of about that say he had the most people, so they made him the leader.
Sure. Yeah, I've heard that as well. You had mentioned earlier also that he died at a very early age at 36 before the end of the American Revolution. Can you speculate a little bit on what his career might have been had he survived the war?
Yeah, I've talked to a lot of people about that since the book and the discussion, and you can just tell like he was shoulder to shoulder with Thomas Jefferson. When they communicated back and forth and that kind of a thing. So he was already a member of the House of Delegates of Virginia. I think it's easy to speculate he had a he had an easy path to governor of Virginia because he was known by everyone, the
Mhm.
leaders. Um, when he after the Battle of Kings Mountain, I tracked his path home, and he first went up to the Moravians and turned the prisoners over. And then he went to Hillsborough and talked to the Continental Army. Then he went to Richmond. So just imagine the excitement. Here's this tall, handsome, strong guy in buckskins that's just coming back from one of the biggest victories in the war, and he took Richmond by storm. I mean, everybody wanted to see William Campbell. He was the man of the hour. So I know that he was well respected throughout all the political leaders of Virginia, and I can see easily it's Virginia. His grandson, there's portraits of William Campbell, but they were not taken in life. It was said that his grandson, a senator from South Carolina, was just identical. He looked exactly like his grandfather. So I know his grandson begot the United States Senate. I think it's very easy to see that had he lived,
Mhm.
he'd have been a governor of Virginia, a United States senator, and who knows what else beyond that. But governor and senator almost for sure, in my opinion.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Well, what have you learned about the events that were transpiring at the same time of the American Revolution? For example, Dunmore's War, the Yellow Creek Massacre, and Boonesboro that are not covered in traditional history. I know you've done a lot of extensive research and you've uncovered a lot of things in your work on Elijah Campbell, but what are some of those events that emerged that you were doing research on?
Well, it's just so interesting. Dunmore's War, which Glenn Williams has written a wonderful book about, was a war that went on in 1774. And that was Campbell's first military experience. He was a captain. He learned to do basic military things there. And that battle at Point Pleasant in 1774 was happening at the same time as the First Continental Congress. So here's the First Continental Congress. We have that in all our history books. Hey, at the same time, out here in Western Virginia, there's a war going on at which Isaac Shelby and William Campbell are engaged. We don't look at that as one, I call it open the aperture. We haven't looked at the whole integrated picture. You do Lexington and Concord. Lexington and Concord happened about the time of the Yellow Creek Massacre, which is what started the Dunmore's War. And then, Boonesboro happened about the same time as the battles of Lexington and Concord. Daniel Boone went into Kentucky, much against the British desires, and set up Boonesboro at the same time that the American Revolution is starting. So my point is, I've just learned by working on this, holy mackerel, there's a lot going on that the traditional histories don't cover. And the thing I mentioned before to you is that George Washington had all that picture. George Washington, I'm working on Elijah Clark now, and I told you that, there were 3 invasions of Florida during the American. Who knew? And you read Washington's correspondence, he was very tuned into what's going on in Florida, in the American Revolution, what's going on at Fort Pitt, what's going on at the lead mines down where Campbell lives. So there's a big architecture of so many events and geography that are not in the traditional histories that I think really are part of the story. And the point to me is Washington and his staff understood all this. They had a picture of it. And I hope some future historian really digs into that and gives us the whole picture, not just Lexington. Well, what was going on in all of America? There was a lot going on.
Yeah, absolutely. People don't think about the frontier. They sometimes hear about or read about George Rogers Clark and that Western campaign, and very little is known actually, even in the history books about the Iroquois campaign much later, with
Right.
Broadhead and others. But that's
Yes.
interesting as well. Yeah, I agree that more needs to be done on those areas. So, well, John, what's your final takeaway of this book that you've written and spent so much time on? why is it important to remember William Campbell, and why is he so important?
Well, if you look back and say what his landmark events are, you'd have to say the Battle of Kings Mountain is certainly at the top of his life of accomplishment. That was the battle that turned around the South. Up until then, Cornwallis had a clear path north. He was going to go to Charlotte, then up through North Carolina, then into Virginia. And when these frontiersmen took Patrick Ferguson off the defense of his left flank, he had to return to South Carolina. He retreated to Winnsboro because he knew the frontier was going to be a real problem for him on his left flank as he went north. So that battle is enormously important. And it was these frontiersmen, people with the great single shot rifle uh, that surrounded Kings Mountain. No artillery, no cavalry, totally frontier riflemen that surrounded Kings Mountain and took Patrick Ferguson and his army and just totally devastated that outfit. So Cornwallis could not proceed north from there. Campbell was the commander. Now, he wasn't the directive telling everybody, he was the chairman of the board of the Riflemen at Kings Mountain. But he, I believe, was involved in the strategy of surrounding the mountain. Absolutely was key to its victory because there was no way for Ferguson to get away once they did that. And he went on to be successful as Lafayette's commander of his rifle corps and the small battles there in Virginia prior to Yorktown. But again, unfortunately, he died, as we say, before Yorktown, actually. So I think if you look back, you'd have to say this is a very, very fine leader, many, many capabilities, a future leader of the country, really. But his mark on history is command at Kings Mountain, in my opinion.
That's amazing. Well, John, thank you so much for joining me today to talk about William Campbell and the American Revolution. It's been a pleasure to have you on the Real American Revolution again.
Thank you very much, Randy. I appreciate the opportunity.
Well, to our viewers and listeners, I've been talking today with historian John Beakes, author of William Campbell and the American Revolution. So, on behalf of the Real American Revolution and the Virginia Council for the Social Studies, thank you for joining us today. My name is Randy Flood. So long for now.